The morning sun cast long shadows through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Church. The pews were filled with mourners dressed in black, their faces etched with grief and solemnity. But in the very back row, almost hidden in the shadows, sat a man in a crisp police uniform. His badge gleamed in the filtered light, and his cap rested perfectly on his head. Yet something was wrong with this picture of authority and composure. Tears streamed down his weathered face. Not the quiet, dignified tears of a formal mourner, but the raw, uncontrolled sobs of someone whose world had just collapsed. His broad shoulders shook with each breath, and he made no attempt to wipe away the wetness that stained his cheeks. Two elderly women in the row ahead of him turned to steal glances. One leaned toward the other, her voice barely above a whisper but loud enough for others to hear. "Look at that police officer," she murmured, adjusting her black hat. "Crying like a baby. Must be one of those soft ones. Probably can't handle the real tough stuff on the streets." Her companion nodded knowingly. "In my day, men in uniform had more backbone, especially the police. They were made of sterner stuff." The officer heard every word. His jaw clenched slightly, but he didn't turn around. He didn't defend himself. He simply kept his eyes fixed on the altar ahead, where a small casket sat surrounded by white lilies and baby's breath. More whispers rippled through the congregation. A middle-aged man in an expensive suit turned to his wife. "What's a cop doing here anyway? Probably just some publicity stunt. They always show up at these things for the cameras." "No cameras here," his wife replied. "Maybe he's just being dramatic. You know how some people are at funerals." The officer's hands were clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had turned white. Every whisper felt like a knife, but he endured it. He had to be here. He had promised. The service continued with hymns and prayers, but the officer seemed to exist in his own world of pain. When others stood, he stood. When they sat, he sat. But his movements were mechanical, as if he were operating on autopilot while his mind was somewhere else entirely. The priest, Father McKenna, was a kind man in his 60s who had conducted more funerals than he cared to count. But this one was different. This one hurt in a way that reached deep into his soul. He looked out at the congregation, his eyes briefly meeting those of the officer in the back. "We gather today not just to mourn," Father McKenna began, his voice carrying through the church, "but to celebrate a life that, though brief, touched more hearts than many lives twice its length." The officer's breath caught in his throat. He remembered the first time he had met the boy. It was 3 years ago, on a rainy Tuesday evening in October. The call had come in as a routine house fire, but when he arrived on the scene, nothing about it had been routine. The flames were already consuming the second floor of the small duplex when he pulled up. The fire department was still 2 minutes out, but 2 minutes might as well have been 2 hours. He could hear screaming from inside, a child's voice, high and terrified, calling for help. Without thinking, without waiting for backup or proper equipment, he had grabbed a wet blanket from a neighbor and plunged into the smoke-filled building. The heat was overwhelming, the smoke so thick he could barely breathe. But that voice kept calling, kept guiding him through the maze of flames and falling debris. He found the boy in an upstairs bedroom, huddled under a desk, too scared to move. The child was maybe 5 years old, with wide brown eyes and tear-streaked cheeks. The officer had scooped him up, wrapped him in the blanket, and carried him to safety just as the roof began to collapse. The boy's name was Tommy Martinez. His mother worked 2 jobs to support them. And that night she had been at her second shift at the hospital. A faulty space heater had started the fire, and Tommy had been asleep when the smoke detectors went off. By the time he woke up, the flames had already blocked the stairs. "Are you a real police officer?" Tommy had asked in the ambulance, his small hand gripping the officer's sleeve. "Yes, son. I'm Officer Davis, and you're safe now. I want to be a police officer when I grow up," Tommy had declared with the certainty that only children possess. "I want to save people just like you saved me." Officer Davis had smiled and ruffled the boy's hair. "That's a fine dream, Tommy. A very fine dream." But the relationship hadn't ended there. Officer Davis had made it his business to check on Tommy and his mother regularly. He helped connect them with resources after the fire, made sure they had a safe place to stay, and even helped Maria Martinez find a better job with hours that allowed her to be home with Tommy more often. Tommy became fascinated with police work. He would pepper Officer Davis with questions whenever he visited. What was it like to chase bad guys? Did he ever get scared? Could he show Tommy how to use handcuffs? Officer Davis answered every question with patience and care. And slowly, what had begun as a rescue had evolved into something like a father-son relationship. The officer had no children of his own. His job had cost him his marriage years ago, and he had thrown himself into his work as a way to fill the emptiness. But Tommy had changed that. The boy had given him a reason to come home, a reason to be careful on the streets, a reason to imagine a future beyond the next shift. They spent weekends together. Officer Davis taught Tommy to throw a baseball, helped him with homework, and took him to the police station for special tours. Tommy was like a sponge, absorbing everything about police work with the enthusiasm only a child could muster. "When I'm old enough, I'm going to be your partner," Tommy had announced one day while they were playing catch in the park. "We'll fight crime together." "I'd like that, son," Officer Davis had replied, meaning every word. "I'd like that very much." Tommy had even gotten a junior police uniform for his 8th birthday. It was a perfect miniature version of Officer Davis's uniform, complete with a plastic badge and a toy radio. He wore it everywhere, to school, to the grocery store, to church. He was so proud of it, and Officer Davis was proud of him. The congregation stirred as Father McKenna's voice brought Officer Davis back to the present moment. The priest was gesturing toward the casket, and Davis felt his heart break all over again. Tommy Martinez was a light in this world. Father McKenna continued. Even at 8 years old, he had dreams of serving others, of protecting the innocent, of making the world a better place. The leukemia had come suddenly and without warning. One day, Tommy was playing baseball, full of energy and life. The next, he was in the hospital, pale and weak, his small body fighting a battle it couldn't win. The doctors had tried everything: chemotherapy, radiation, experimental treatments. But the cancer was too aggressive, too advanced. Officer Davis had been there through it all. He had held Tommy's hand during the worst of the treatments, had slept in hospital chairs for weeks on end, had read stories and played games to help pass the long, painful hours. He had used all his vacation time and sick days, had taken unpaid leave when that ran out, and had never once complained. "I'm scared, Officer Davis," Tommy had whispered one night, his voice barely audible over the beeping of the machines. "I know, son. I'm scared too. But you're the bravest person I know. Braver than any police officer I've ever worked with." "Will you be there when I graduate from the police academy?" Tommy had asked, his eyes bright with fever and hope. "I'll be in the front row," Officer Davis had promised. "I'll be so proud. I'll probably cry." Tommy had smiled at that. "Police officers don't cry. This one does," Officer Davis had said, wiping away a tear. "This one does." The final weeks had been the hardest. Tommy grew weaker and weaker, but his spirit never dimmed. He still talked about becoming a police officer, still asked questions about the job, still wore his uniform whenever he felt strong enough. The nurses at the hospital had adopted him as their unofficial mascot, and even the doctors would stop by just to chat with the brave little boy in the police uniform. Officer Davis had been holding Tommy's hand when the end came. It was peaceful as such things can be. Tommy had simply closed his eyes and slipped away, leaving behind a hole in the world that could never be filled. The funeral arrangements had been difficult. Maria Martinez was devastated, barely able to function, let alone plan a service. Officer Davis had quietly taken care of everything: the church, the flowers, the music, even the small casket. He had called in favors from fellow officers, had organized everything with the precision of a military operation. But he hadn't expected the whispers and stares. He hadn't expected to be judged by people who didn't know Tommy, who didn't understand what they had meant to each other. He was just a man in uniform crying at a funeral, and to the observers, that was weakness. Father McKenna was reaching the end of his sermon now, and Officer Davis felt a familiar tightness in his chest. This was almost over. Soon Tommy would be laid to rest, and the world would move on. But Officer Davis knew he would never be the same. Before we proceed to the final viewing, Father McKenna announced, "I want to share something special. Tommy's mother has asked me to read a letter that Tommy wrote to his hero just a few weeks before he passed away." Officer Davis looked up sharply. He hadn't known about any letter. Father McKenna pulled out a piece of paper covered in a child's careful handwriting. It says, "Dear Officer Davis, thank you for saving my life and for being my friend. I know I might not get to be a real police officer, but I hope I was good enough to be your pretend partner. You are the best police officer in the whole world, and I love you like you are my dad. Please don't be sad when I'm gone. I will watch over you from heaven and help you catch the bad guys. Your friend forever, Tommy." The church was silent, absolutely silent. Even the whispers had stopped. Officer Davis felt his world tilt. He had been Tommy's hero, but Tommy had been his salvation. The boy had given him purpose, had shown him what it meant to truly protect and serve. And now he was gone. Father McKenna nodded to the pallbearers, 6 of Officer Davis's colleagues who had volunteered for this duty. They approached the casket with military precision, their faces solemn and respectful. But instead of closing the casket for the final time, they carefully opened it for one last viewing. The congregation gasped collectively. There, peaceful and perfect, lay Tommy Martinez. He was dressed in his junior police uniform, the one he had worn with such pride. His plastic badge gleamed on his chest, and his toy radio was clipped to his belt. He looked like he was just sleeping, like he might wake up at any moment and ask Officer Davis to take him on patrol. But it was the photograph placed beside the casket that truly told the story. It showed Tommy and Officer Davis at the park, both of them grinning at the camera. Tommy was wearing his uniform, and Officer Davis had an arm around the boy's shoulders. They looked like what they were, a father and son, bonded not by blood, but by love and respect and shared dreams. Father McKenna spoke softly, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent church. Tommy dreamed of wearing a real uniform, of carrying a real badge, of serving alongside the man who had saved his life. He wanted to be just like Officer Davis, the hero who had risked everything to pull him from that burning building 3 years ago. The congregation began to understand. This wasn't just a police officer at a random funeral. This was a man mourning his son, his partner, his reason for getting up every morning. The whispers and judgments seemed petty and cruel now, and several people looked away in shame. But Officer Davis didn't notice their change in attitude. He was lost in his own grief, his own memories, his own regret. He stood up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. Every eye in the church was on him now, but he didn't care. He had something to do. He walked down the aisle with the measured pace of a man carrying an enormous burden. His footsteps echoed in the silence, and with each step, he felt the weight of his promise, the weight of his failure, the weight of his love for the boy who would never grow up to be his partner. When he reached the front of the church, he stopped beside the casket. Tommy looked so small, so peaceful, so young. Officer Davis knelt down, his knees hitting the cold marble floor with a soft thud. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his badge. Not a toy one, but his real badge. The one he had worn for 15 years. The one that represented everything he was and everything he stood for. "I told you I'd be there for your first day on the force," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I just didn't know it would be like this." He placed the badge next to Tommy's folded hands. It was a gesture of respect, of love, of a promise kept in the only way possible. The badge would go with Tommy, a symbol of the dreams they had shared and the future that would never be. Officer Davis stood up slowly, his hand moving to his forehead in a perfect salute. It was a salute for a fellow officer, for a brave soul, for a son who had taught him what it meant to truly serve and protect. He held the salute for a long moment, his tears falling freely now, and no one in the church thought less of him for it. Then he turned and walked back up the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the silence. People watched him go, their faces filled with understanding and respect. They had misjudged him, had seen weakness where there was actually the deepest kind of strength. He was a man who had loved completely and lost everything, and he was still standing. As he reached the back of the church, Officer Davis paused at the door. He looked back one last time at the small casket, at the photograph, at the badge that gleamed next to the boy's hands. Then he stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun, alone but not broken, carrying the memory of a boy who had wanted to save the world. The church doors closed behind him with a soft click, and the congregation was left to contemplate what they had witnessed. They had seen a man stripped of all pretense, all professional distance, all the barriers that usually separate the public from the private. They had seen pure love and pure loss, and they would never forget it. Outside, Officer Davis walked slowly to his patrol car. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, staring at the empty passenger seat where Tommy used to sit during their rides around the neighborhood. The boy had loved those rides, had peppered him with questions about every call, every procedure, every aspect of police work. He started the engine and drove away, leaving behind the church, the mourners, and the judgment. But he took with him something more valuable than any badge, the memory of a boy who had seen him not as a uniform or authority figure, but as a hero worth emulating. Tommy had made him a better man, a better officer, a better human being, And as Officer Davis drove through the city streets, he made a silent promise to Tommy's memory. He would continue to serve, to protect, to be the kind of officer that Tommy had believed him to be. He would carry the boy's dreams forward, would live up to the faith that had been placed in him. The badge on his chest might be gone, but the badge in his heart would never tarnish. It would always shine as brightly as the day an 8-year-old boy had told him he wanted to be a police officer, just like his hero. Tommy Martinez had wanted to make the world a better place. In 8 short years, he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. He had changed one police officer's life forever, and through that officer, he would continue to touch countless other lives. The boy in the junior police uniform was gone, but his legacy would live on in every life his hero touched, every person he helped, every moment he chose compassion over cynicism. Tommy had taught him that being a police officer wasn't just about enforcing laws or catching criminals. It was about being worthy of a child's trust, worthy of their dreams, worthy of their love. Officer Davis drove toward his next call, his next chance to serve, his next opportunity to honor the memory of the bravest person he had ever known. The tears on his face were drying now, but the love in his heart would never fade. In the distance, he could almost hear Tommy's voice asking one more question. "What's our next case, partner?" And for the first time since losing him, Officer Davis smiled.